Have you ever had a package accidentally delivered to you that wasn't yours? With the number of packages shipped every day, it shouldn't be a surprise that this sometimes happens. But what if the thing that was shipped to your house was capable of exterminating not just you, but your entire society? How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boil Hobby Time. My friend Bill hosts something called the Big Bot Bash every year. He sends out a little randomizer that, when coupled with a D20, dictates the type of robot that you're supposed to build. And this is what I came up with. The head was supposed to be a dome, but I didn't have many dome-shaped things on hand, so I just went with one that I did have and built the rest of the bot around that. Conveniently, it has some little windows, recessed areas that will turn into some eyes later on. The rules of the Big Bot Bash are that you have to kit bash your bot from trash or bits that you have lying around, but absolutely no 3D printing. I'm not sure why injection molded plastic bits aren't also forbidden, but it's helpful that they aren't, because otherwise I would have been up a creek. The large round piece that we're going to call a neck didn't have much surface detail, so I greeblyed that up before moving down to the shoulders, which I made from 3 bits that I stole from a Terra Cruz missile kit. It was gifted to me by a viewer named Tyler. Actually, many of the pieces that I used in this build are from that kit, so shout out to Tyler for that. The bottom of each of those pieces was hollow, so in order to give them a little bit more strength, as well as a more unified look, I traced and cut out the shape of the bottom using a thick sheet of styrene. I tapered the styrene with a file, and then I found the center of that piece. I drilled a hole for another post that will suspend it above the rest of the torso. For arms, I rolled a club. And I didn't want to just add arms holding a club, so I added these wires instead, and my justification for why those are arms is this definition on Merriam-Webster. I know that's a bit of a stretch, but everything is supposed to be open for interpretation. I then moved on to the lower section of the torso. I added this piece with a big hole in it because I wanted to install a tank that would sit vertically. Kind of looks like one of those hamster feeder water tanks, but this one does not hold water. I connected the upper and lower torso sections together and moved around the bot, adding bits here and there, including some hydraulic pistons to help this thing keep its balance. For the body, I got the word upperdy. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean, so I just made one section of the body more upperdy than the other. The final piece here, before we can move on to the legs, was to complete the hips, which is a long beam that I cleaned up and cut at an angle at each end. And then I sealed off each end with another cut of that same thick styrene that I used before. After that had been cleaned up with a file and glued in place, I added some rings on either side, which will become the hip sockets, and I'll show you how those work in just a sec. To make these little rings work as hip sockets, I'll need something round to fit in there. And the something round that I found were from these torso pieces from a Boba Fett model. I snipped those free and then glued them to some femurs, which I made from more pieces of that Terra Cruiser missile kit. The front and back legs on this thing are going to be different in size and length. That won't be a problem, because I made them to be very adjustable. After the femurs had been glued in place, I began working on the lower section of the legs, and I made those from some pistons. The descriptor that I got for the legs was sharp, so I found these Gundam pieces that fit the bill, and I glued a ball to the top of each of those tube sections of those hydraulic pistons, and then finally I put the feet in place. I guess that's what you can call them. And because all of these were made the way they were, they could be adjusted to whatever length they needed to be for this to stand upright on its own 4 feet. I then finally reinforced all the legs with additional hydraulics to make it look at least somewhat mechanically feasible. And then I used this gun, which was donated to me by Jahan, Lord of Cats, for the weapon on top of the head. Technically, it's not a gun, it's a sprayer, like an insect repellent sprayer. I'll explain more about that in a minute. The last thing I did in the construction was to add some hoses, connecting everything together, making a path for the liquid from the tank to the sprayer on the top. After that, I cleaned up my workstation. Now that the construction's done, I'll catch everybody up to speed on the backstory. This is the third installment in a series about Ermi, a robot manufacturer that's essentially an intergalactic Sears Roebuck. The manufacturer sends out a paper catalog, and the customers can submit mail orders to receive their robots. The catalog has everything from small household chore bots all the way through interplanetary domination bots. The problem is the mail order system and their whole infrastructure is pretty behind because they're dealing with millions of planets around the universe. Because of some mishaps, this guy ended up on the wrong planet. I'll explain more about that while I do the painting. This box of minis was sent to me a while back by Jared. I decided to use them for today's build. Obviously they're Confederates, but in our story they're not Southern Confederates. They're just another group of humans from a planet who is currently in their ball and musket phase of their history. They stand in lines and shoot at each other. Remember, it's not about accuracy, it's about volume. Anyway, after snipping the soldiers from their sprues, I put everything down on the table to get a feel for the general layout. In order to make this type of combat make sense, we'll need to have some nice open space and a mostly flat field, which I'll need a 10 by 13 or 14-inch sheet of XPS for, which I double stacked on one end. After gluing the sheets together with some foam-safe super glue, I shaved the top sheet at a very gentle incline or decline down to the same level as the lower one. I did this very carefully with my utility knife. To get things even more optimal for rifle lines, I sanded the foam till it was nice and smooth. I obviously wore a respirator while I was doing this. I checked the size and the layout one more time, and everything was looking good, but we can get this thing just a little smoother using some plaster, paint, and Mod Podge. This terrain paste will create a nice durable coat that helps hide the appearance of the foam, which I can also smooth out with my hand to give it a much nicer feel. Once I was completely dry, I spread out another layer of Mod Podge across the whole thing, but this time it was to catch some flocking, which I sprinkled generously from above. Made sure that it was evenly applied, and I sprayed the whole thing with isopropyl alcohol, followed by watered down white glue. And off camera, I added one other color of flocking for some variation, and my gentle hillside was done. And while the terrain dries, we'll get these minis painted up. I threw the soldiers in some lines on some long flat things, and I glued those, put them in some painting handles, and while I paint everything, I will explain the full story of what's going on in this ridiculous diorama. The robot here was purchased by a construction company about 100 years ago. It was used for the purpose of cleaning out an infestation of hornets in a swamp where a developer was trying to build a self-storage facility. The bot arrived, made short work of the bugs, and then essentially just sat unused for nearly a century. At some point, a bookkeeper for the construction company was looking through old receipts and found one for the bug repellent bot. She called Ermi and asked what the return policy was, and because they work with such long distances and timescales, she found that they hadn't exceeded the return window. So she was excited for an unexpected refund. They loaded the bot back up onto a skid and sent it back to Ermi. Now you may be wondering why the people are so much smaller than this bot if the bot is indeed a bug repellent bot. In reality, this bot is only 6 feet tall, at least to you and me, which is obviously way smaller than it appears to be when compared to the size of these soldiers here. Well, how that happened, it's kind of like Gulliver's Travels. The cargo freighter that was returning the bot to Ermi was caught in a strange solar storm. The ship was thrown around wildly and collided with an asteroid or two, causing it to be sent tumbling off into time and space. When things finally evened out and the ship came to, all of the shipping logs were scrambled, and it decided to deliver its packages to the nearest planet it could find, which was not on record and happened to be a planet full of tiny people in their colonial era. The humans on this planet were in the process of fighting a territorial war near where the bot landed, and then the bot, when it stood up and saw the people, found itself in a bit of a pickle. There was conflicting code happening within its programming, causing a moral dilemma. Under no circumstances was this bot allowed to spray pesticides at humans. However, these yellow humans looked and sounded like little bugs. They also fit within the size parameters of everything that it was trained to exterminate. As you can see, it's quite a predicament. The robot began weighing its options and calculating the correct response to the situation. The input metric that was keeping the robot from opening fire is that all these little yellow creatures looked and behaved like humans. In its thinking, humans hate bugs, and therefore should never cause harm to an exterminator bot. If they should attack, it would be a clear indication that they like bugs. Therefore, they are not human. Ermi didn't necessarily install the best logical fallacy compensation chip on this model. The commander of the little army has no idea the weight of the consequences that his decision could make. Hopefully he realizes that because this thing hasn't fired yet, they should probably just leave it alone. The last thing to do on this paint job was to give this robot some nice, bright, neon green glowing eyes. With all the painting done, it was time to set up my battlefield. Once all the soldiers were in place, I painted the exposed foam edges with some black 3.0. The last thing to do was to set our bot in place, and after that, I called it good. Before moving on to my final shots, please take a moment to appreciate the artwork submitted by my patrons for our monthly art challenge, the theme of which was retro gaming. I didn't necessarily work retro gaming into my build, but we can just say it's a crossover between BioShock and Age of Empires, which aren't retro games, but they are to some people. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons, and a big thank you to Bill Making Stuff for hosting the Big Bot Bash. Be sure to go check out all the other videos in this year's playlist. I hope you all have a great week. I'll see you next time.